Evening, everyone. Hello. Multiple things happening here, but I suppose the most momentous. It is the 100th day of the Labour government. So there's always this thing: what happens in the first 100 days? Keir Starmer's brought out a video on his assessment. We're going to spend rather longer on it. The good, the bad, and the ugly. There's been good, bad, and ugly. Let's be honest. There's a couple of comments in there about the video I did on the US presidential election as well. I will just point out, I have had some very interesting comments, including, of course, from Americans, explaining a few things I had not considered. It's really very interesting, but also extremely worrying. Extremely worrying if you are, like most people, scared stupid about the orange one actually becoming president again, because unfortunately at the moment I'm having to say it's really, it should not be this close. It should not be this, like, countries, populations will, yes, vote for not the best choice, shall we say. That happens a lot. I would argue it happens in this country every time someone votes for a Conservative government. And I think I can prove it. I think I can prove it with data. When people say, oh, yeah, oh, Thatcher did a marvellous job with the economy. It's like, have you seen the economy in the 80s? Have you looked at the economic data? I don't think you have. But anyway, the problem is with Trump, he's just so obviously unsuitable. So obviously unsuitable. But anyway, this country, 100 days of Labour. Have I any words about the death of Alex Salmond? Well, no, because you don't speak ill of the dead. So no. So what I'm going to go through is what is my assessment. We can always add to this as well. Just in general terms about Labour's first 100 days, what sort of gone well, what has not gone well, and what has been, as I say, very, very ugly. Good ones, first of all, I think just we're not going to do the silly long list of each individual piece of legislation they've presented to the House. Although I will notice, so Labour have been promoting their 100 days, they've been doing things like, in terms of like the Employment Rights Bill, which of course is their big flagship piece of legislation. So we say, I was going to say policy then, but you could argue there's multiple flagship policies. The Employment Rights Bill is clearly one of them, but also their sort of GB Energy thing is another. Planning, getting more buildings, more homes built is another. But in terms of big, hefty piece of legislation, the Employment Rights Bill, and there's been various Labour accounts today going, fire and rehire gone, 0 hours contracts gone. I'm thinking, well, they're not. Is this how it works though? Because they're not actually gone yet. They've only just introduced the legislation. They're not gone until the legislation's passed. And even when the legislation has passed, there's an implementation period. But maybe that's how you have to do it. Because there are people, when I would talk about the last Labour government, there are people even now, I say even now, it's probably more likely even now, where people will say things like, well, when Tony Blair came to power in his first 100 days, he made the Bank of England independent. It's like, no, he didn't. He announced it. They started the process, but it was the year later when it actually became independent because it required legislation. You can't just legislate for something, in the blink of an eye, unless it's like the old secondary legislation, statutory instruments and stuff like that. But you're supposed to be a bit careful about how you use those. Promoter saying that in the good list, I'd add an effective response to far-right riots, initial response. So I did think about that. However, I'm in two minds about it. First of all, it was essentially a tried and trusted response from 2011 or 2012? Which of course, was Keir Starmer again in a different role. And the other thing is, in terms of the effectiveness, so yes, that approach, which was the same approach, so it was nothing new, that approach did work to take the wind out of its sails pretty quickly. But I'm also going to say, I'm not sure whether to put it in the good or bad, because, and this is, you can't expect the government to do anything about this in the short term. But what's happened? We've had people who were directly involved in the riots, being properly hammered by justice. We have not had a single instigator, like main instigator or organiser, even arrested. We did have Bernie Spofford, but has been released without charge. Now, I'm not going to comment on whether she should have been released without charge or not. I'm not a legal expert, so I don't know in any particular case whether certain laws have been broken or not, or if there's enough evidence that laws have been broken or not. What I do know is this: the people who are the small number of people, like this is an avalanche, right? It's like a few rocks that leads to an avalanche. The small number of people who really are fundamentally responsible for those riots, they seem fine. They seem fine to me. So I, at the very least, think it's too early to say whether that's good, bad, or ugly. I would expect that when the dust settles in, say, a year's time and there's a bit of reflection going on, if they haven't dealt with the people really behind it who've created the conditions for it, but more specifically who did the organising, because there was a great deal of organising going on for a very long time in advance. If you don't get those, then something isn't right. Either the legislation isn't good enough, or police resourcing isn't good enough, and the government, I would expect, to deal with whatever the problem is. And if they don't, if it just sort of, in a couple of years' time, they're all going, oh yeah, we dealt with it, didn't we? And I'll be looking at it going, no, you didn't. I won't be very happy. So that is why I haven't put it on there, even though you could, in theory, put it on. But if I go down really quickly. So to begin with, it was actually, I mean, people talk about, even Keir Starmer's had to admit that his first 100 days has had its issues, right? But the first few days were absolutely brilliant. And I don't just mean because we suddenly had the grown-ups back in charge and things like that. Actual moves they made were very positive. So are these expert ministerial appointments? I know every time you get an expert into a ministerial appointment, it means it's someone who's not elected, so you want to keep it to a minimum. But the ones they did were very, very good. So we had James Timpson in as prisons minister, and that is looking very good. Even now, that is looking very positive. You know, there's increasing talk about proper reforms of the penal system in this country. And obviously, it's one of these things that will take many, many years to bed in. But it does sound like they're not just going to do sticking plaster solutions here. We had, we also had Valance as science minister, which is very interesting. But also we have an actual, so Attorney General, and although I was incredibly disappointed that Emily Thornberry lost her cabinet position, although she has got a senior position, she's going to be head of which select committee is it? Someone remind me. She's going to be the chair of a decent select committee. I can't remember if it's the Home Affairs or the Foreign Affairs. I think it's a good one though. But we have now, and remember, the job of the Attorney General is effectively to advise the government on whether what they're doing is legal. Now, to my mind, there are two advantages to having a proper lawyer do that, not a politician. The first is that you can get someone who's absolutely top of their game. Normally, your Attorney General has to be, and there's always lots of MPs who have legal qualifications, so you can always find someone who's qualified for the job. But you're basically trying to find someone who will agree to... So you're talking about someone who's not a rebel, so it's someone who's going to agree to accept ministerial responsibility, and also someone who can do that job properly. Well, why not get someone at the top of the legal game? And also, if Labour did try anything like Blair did with the Iraq war, there's no political shackles on them. They'll just say, I'm resigning, I'm off. That'll be it. They won't, so I think that was a really good move that showed that the Labour government is serious about obeying the law, because it's going to be it'd be bloody embarrassing if they don't, because they'll not keep this guy quiet. Pranay is saying, I think I'm going to say at this point I'd rank Starmer over Blair as PM. Still needs to show results, but while Blair was good at winning, I'd say he was a worse Labour PM. Well, I don't think we can judge Starmer in terms of the practical side as a PM. What I would say is he's clearly not as good at the politics. But part of that can also be the advice. Like, Tony Blair was actually genuinely on his own, in isolation, very good at politics. But he also had very good political advisors. Peter Mandelson, Alistair Campbell, and some people may not like those guys, but they were very good at politics, right? Starmer doesn't have that same, like Morgan McSween. I'm not going to bash. I'm not going to spend all my time bashing him. He's clearly got some great strengths, but he's also clearly got holes in his armour, weaknesses in armour. But what I will say, rather than picking on any individual advisor, what I would say is the political advice operation around Starmer is piss poor. Piss poor. The next good thing, complete lack of scandals. That's always good. Although there's been, you would say, plenty in the news, they're not real scandals. They're not. A scandal, remember, is where someone has done something against the rules. It's not someone has done something that someone else says, well, I don't think that's right. That's not a scandal. That's just you having a different moral compass, right? A scandal is specifically where someone gets found out for breaking the rules, and particularly in a very spicy way. There's no rule breaking taking place. Public sector pay awards was really good. Moving in for that really quickly. It also set the direction of travel, and I was particularly pleased about it, and because for a long time before this election, people were saying, because what Labour was saying is, we can't make promises we can't keep, and the finances are tight, and everyone took that to mean, that means they'll try and suppress public sector pay again, just like the Tories. And I kept saying, because I remember back in 1996, 1997, Labour were doing the same thing. They didn't promise to boost public sector pay, and yet they did, and they did it immediately, straight away. I just entered the teaching profession. I just finished my I was no, that's a lie. I was just starting my training as a teacher, shall we say, when Labour came into office. So they'd been in office about a year when I started teaching, a year and a bit. So I saw it. I saw pay, particularly when you're at the bottom end of the pay scale and, money's tight when you're young, you notice decent pay awards, and that's what I was getting. Luke saying, Phil, just regarding Brexit, why is it that many rejoiners are not as pragmatic as you and think that every day spent at the EU is very damaging? We'll accept it takes some time. Well, it is very damaging, but I think part of the problem also is some people, like, my worry is that some people are saying things that are not true. So when people, for example, say it's costing us £100 billion every year being out of, for every year that Keir Starmer says we're not joining the EU. That's not true. That is actually just untrue for two reasons. First of all, the £100 billion figure is the difference between what we'd sort of have, like at the Treasury, and if we hadn't left. But if we joined the EU tomorrow, we wouldn't get it back. It would still be better. I'm not saying it'd be the same as it is now. We would get something, but we wouldn't get that back, because that is investment and trade that's now permanently lost to us. As soon as a company changes supplier because their previous supplier is unreliable, they don't change back. Unless the previous supplier is suddenly a lot cheaper. Like, there's no reason to... Once you've changed your supply lines, they stay there. So you'd have to rebuild those supply lines, and that would take many years. The other reason is we can't. We literally can't. Like, Peter Mandelson has actually given a speech. Now, he is quite clear. He's not... I don't think he's an official advisor as such, but we know that he is quite influential on Starmer, as he would be, because he was very politically astute when Labour were last in power. And he's been saying that at the moment the EU wouldn't countenance it. We need other EU countries to agree as well. And he's actually suggested that this is something that could happen maybe in 10 years' time. Now, I would like to have the conversation before that. 10 years seems a long time for me. But I will say this, it is inevitable. It's absolutely inevitable. Don there saying, just popping in to hit the shots, wants to reiterate, in my opinion, Labour is playing 2.5 dimensional chess, and people just do not recall non-dumb political moves. The political side of what Labour have done in government, I think, has been fine. For me, it's the problem. There's one bad political move, But for me, the problem is the Downing Street operation. They're not seeing things ahead of time. They're seeing everything in their rear view mirror and reacting really quickly, and therefore making a mess of it. They're not predicting enough very predictable things, which means that there's a lot of knee-jerk reactions, and they're not good ones. Next one was promising legislation put before PM. So that's the King's Speech stuff. There's a lot of stuff in there. The ones that I'm most excited about, I keep saying, is the stuff with water companies, because I see that as a model to deal with lots of dodgy industries, or lots of dodgy parts of industry, should we say. So I'm looking forward to that one. But obviously then there is the big stuff, the Employment Rights Act, as it will be, but Employment Rights Bill as it is at the moment. The stuff on with connected to GB Energy, planning reform, because these are all things that Labour need to sort out. Come the next election, have they improved our energy security? I mean, we know some things like this can take years and years. But as they're getting on with it really quickly, they want to show something. They want to show more than just promise at the next election, which is why they're going in so hard and so fast now. So will they be able to demonstrate that our energy security is now much better? Are we going to be looking smug in a few years' time? Well, not a few years, but maybe 10 years' time, as another oil nation descends into chaos, and we're going, well, we don't need as much oil now, do we? Or at least gas. In terms of planning, building, are we getting more homes built? Are the homes decent? Are we making sure the right people get into those homes? Labour's policy of giving new builds, first-time buyers dibs on new builds to stop people just buying them up en masse and then selling them for whatever, things like that. Will the creation of special economic zone stuff up the UK's chance of joining the EU? No, because we had them in the EU. The other thing to note as well is, we're not. Labour have basically said, like, we'll keep what the Tories gave us, but we're not doing any new ones. And in actual fact, the ones the Tories set up have been actually pathetically exposed recently. I think it was last month. The report was hardly any companies have shown any interest in taking advantage of them, because they're bollocks. I mean, remember, we had there's always differences in types of Freeport, but we had these things before. David Cameron's the one who said we're just binning them because they were a waste of money. So DP World is putting aside its hurt field attending the investment after all, the investment meeting. Yeah, but on that, I don't know, is that because Labour apologised and threw Louise Haig under the bus? So I don't know why that is. I don't know whether that is something to feel good about or bad about, in all honesty. The final one would be, I think, on the good side, enthusiastic engagement with Europe. It's a very, and I know people are saying we still sound a bit reticent and a bit not sure what we're doing, which is also a bad thing. But I will still say it's night and day compared with what we had under the Conservatives. That was very hands-off. It was like, look, we'll talk to you now and then because, okay, sure, there's a few things we need to sort out, but we don't really want to talk to you. Whereas now, the attitude of our government is very much, we actually want to talk to you on lots of things very regularly, and pretty much every area of possible cooperation. But then there are bad things as well, which were not expected. First of all, no strategy for filling the news. This is the big one for me. Absolutely no strategy. It's like they forgot silly season to think. Silly season, for those who don't know, it's what you usually call the summer recess. And the reason it's called silly season is because Parliament's in recess. So straight away, there's not as much stuff going on because MPs aren't going to each other. But even beyond that, even by the standards of a normal recess, first of all, it's very long. It's usually 6. It was 4 weeks this year. It's usually 6 weeks. And MPs are on holiday, which means government ministers are on holiday. So even the government, although that still carries on, winds down a bit. You don't get big announcements or anything. Unless there's a scandal, nothing really happens. And yet, political journalists are still political journalists. They don't get seconded to the sports department to report on the cricket or anything. They still have to find political news stories to write about to keep their jobs. And they need those political news stories to sell. They can't just go, oh, I'll just knock out some old shit. They need it to get the clicks. So they usually try and find something and hype the hell out of it. And it's why it's called silly season. They pick, like, I'll give you an example. The example that sticks in my mind from when Labour were last in power. It was a summer where Tony Blair was on holiday and John Prescott, who was the Deputy Prime Minister, and they had this photo of him playing croquet. And they were going, he's supposed to be running the country now. What if we were invaded? And it's like, as if they think the Prime Minister has to, or Deputy Prime Minister when they're covering, has to be sat at a desk with a phone stuck to their head 24/7. It's like, mate, if we're invaded, someone will tap him on the shoulder. Like, there's an office behind him. But that's silly season. That's what they do. And they should have known the same thing would happen. They should have known the same. Like, it's like they didn't think about it at all. Oh, what are they going to report on? Do you think they might come up with a load of confected rows about our new government? Of course they would. So the fact that they did not think about that, they needed to give political journalists something to write about, something worth their while. They have to understand, Downing Street have to understand, they have to keep feeding journalists, because if they don't, they'll find their own scraps elsewhere. And we know that the media has no interest in covering for Labour. In fact, quite a lot of the media wants to damage them with every possible opportunity. Then, following on that, the poor reaction to silly season. So once they'd failed to fill the news cycle with their own stuff, so inevitably it was filled with someone else's stuff, they then reacted very poorly to it. For example, on the gifts and donations round, say, oh, well, you know, oh, yeah, well, we'll give some money back for these things. Like, why? You didn't do anything wrong. Why not say, oh, if people don't like us, well, we are the servants of the people, so we'll change the rules then. Screw the Tories over while you're at it. Turn it back on them. Really poor reaction. Absolutely immensely stupid. Even the way they've been dealing with the winter fuel allowance, which I'll get onto in the ugly column, is still like, how they dealt with it as a media operation was still very poor. Again, why aren't they turning the tables back on the Conservatives for... Why didn't they say to them, you're complaining that some people are losing £200. Why aren't you complaining about the fact that everyone's bills are like £500 more expensive than they should be because of the Tories? Like, what would you rather? Would you rather be given £200 to help pay your bills, or would you rather your bills are £500 less? Because, you know, I mean, put it into those terms. Losing chief of staff, I don't care what anyone says, that was an absolute disaster. That was a complete shit show. The reasons for it, I will never properly know. Well, not until people write the memoirs. So it could be 20 years before I really find out what happened there, 15, 20 years maybe. Remember, we're only now really finding out what happened behind closed doors at the David Cameron's government. But it sounds ridiculous to me. It doesn't sound to me like Keir Starmer got the wrong person to be his chief of staff. It sounds to me like you're a load of advisors who didn't like a gobby woman being gobby. That's what it sounds like to me. But either way, whatever you look at it, Keir Starmer, it was a massive coup when he persuaded Sue Gray to join his staff. It really upset the Tories. It was absolutely beautiful to see. And to lose her within the first few months is really bad. And yeah, they'll recover from it. Of course they'll recover from it. But it's really bad. And there's no way of sugarcoating it. And then lack of clarity. So as well as so it is good that there's this huge enthusiasm for engagement with Europe. But what's worrying people is this lack of clarity on the EU strategy. Labour have yet to set out exactly what they want. Now, we know what they want in general terms. They haven't set out real proposals. I would have thought, given that there are several years to think about it, it shouldn't be possible for people to say that they don't know what Labour want. So that, to me, is, and all of these things essentially are communications issues, aren't they, really? That's why I say, I haven't had a problem. Like, I'm not going to sit here and say, oh, you know, some of these cabinet ministers aren't really working out. Yeah, they're not shaping up. I mean, there's individual policies, don't get me wrong, that I've disagreed with. But in terms of their political performance, it's not shadow cabinet anymore. The cabinet have been fine. They've been exemplary in some cases, in fact. So politically, it's fine. The top team, the leadership have all been fine. Good in some cases. It's the communications, it's the political advice, it's the advisors, it's the SPADs. They're the ones who are messing up, and yet they're blaming other people. I'm a bit worried about that. Ivan, they're saying, as a member of the Labour Party on the whole, it's been a successful first 100 days. My misgivings are what the government are not saying, particularly on improving the lives of disabled people. Yes, that is a big one for me as well, and I think it is also quite right to say, when you are not particularly... See, it's particularly worrying when, again, you consider that they're not feeding the news cycle. And it's across the board. It's across the board. I mean, I say on my channel, for example, you know, I expected, I quite like the fact that there aren't such really torrid political stories coming out, but I can do that. I can go, okay, views are down for a bit because there's not as much of spicy stuff to talk about. That's fine. I'm still fine. Political journalists don't see it that way. The media don't see it that way. They need to have... They're already struggling, you know, particularly newspapers. They're already struggling. Their profits are not good. Some of them aren't even making profits. So they're not going to accept the fact that, oh, news isn't as sexy at the moment, so we'll just ride it out. They're not going to do that. So so Labour should be going, well, but we're going to do this and we're going to do that, and they should be pumping out information to journalists so they'll write about it. So given that, the fact that they're not... Because ordinarily you might say, well, if they're not talking about disabled people, it's because there's so many things to talk about, and it's like I keep saying before the election, there's only so much bandwidth to get your messaging out. It's just that at the moment, there's a massive amount of available bandwidth, right? Because there's not a lot happening. Until the budget hits, there's not a lot happening, really. You know, legislation, yeah, you can talk about the legislation being put forward, but we've known about that for 2 years. There aren't really many surprises in the legislation we're getting. It's pretty much what they've been promising for 2 years at least. So, yeah, I worry about the emphasis on, you know, particularly people with disabilities, because even if they make largely the right moves, the fact that they're not communicating it very well, if that is indeed what they're going to do, that's actually distressing for people who are very vulnerable. I do think that any government needs to go out of its way to explain to the most vulnerable people what they're going to do to help them, rather than just saying to them, patting them on the head and saying, trust us, it'll be fine. You know, so I'm worried. I think there are potentially gaps there. And there've always been these gaps, like under the last Labour government, there were gaps. So it is going to be a very worrying time. In terms of the ugly, I've got two uglies, I think. One of them's very recent. The first one is the winter fuel allowance. The way it's been done is politically inept. As soon as they announced it, I straight away did a video where I said, look, okay, I'm not opposed to means testing, but it is a politically bold move to remove something like this from older voters. In fact, there's I don't know if anyone's read this. I wouldn't normally encourage anyone to read The Spectator, by the way. It's a terrible rag. Michael Gove's going to be the editor of it now, but it's a terrible rag. However, there's an article by Nick Cohen in it. Now, Nick Cohen's sort of all right. You won't agree with him on everything, but he wrote an article which looks like it's not behind the paywall, because I draw the line at The Spectator. I do have subscriptions to quite a lot of outlets, some of which I do not like pay money to, but I need to see what they're writing about. I don't really need to see what The Spectator are writing about. But this one appears to be in front of the paywall. Keir Starmer's fortunes are about to change is the name of the article. And there's a good bit in it where he talks about taxation. It says, Louis XIV's finance minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, declared that the art of taxation consists in so plucking the goose as to obtain the largest possible amount of feathers with the smallest possible amount of hissing. which is actually a really good way of putting it. And then he says, Rachel Reeves has got the smallest possible amount of feathers with the largest possible amount of hissing. And that is actually a good way of describing the winter fuel allowance as it has appeared, because it doesn't save that much in itself. If you were to make sure that everyone who absolutely needed it got it, which is clearly not going to be the case, so that's storing up problems for later, it would save even less. Basically, politically, the way they've done it, although means testing it you can justify, means testing and letting lots of vulnerable people fall through the cracks in your means testing is not justified or justifiable. And it's also politically naive, because you're talking about elderly voters, big block of voters. Although they're not the most important voters for Labour, you don't dismiss them easily. But they are very important readers of news media. So you know the newspapers are going to go on at it. And it's a politically bad move. But it goes into the ugly column specifically because it's one that's going to carry on getting worse. Because like I said, this winter, I can almost guarantee it, the Tory media especially, but any of the media, because remember, they want to sell their papers, they want their clicks, right? They want their views. They're going to be looking around for someone who dies. They're going to be doing a dead granny search this winter. And they're going to find someone who had the winter fuel payment taken off them. And they're going to say, Keir Starmer murdered this old dear. That's what's going to happen. As sure as night follows day, that is what is going to happen this winter. So, like, if Labour had just announced a bad economic policy, right? Because in theory, just the policy doesn't make a great deal of difference. It doesn't it doesn't save very much money. It's not taking a huge amount of money off anyone, but just the suggestion that it could result in someone's death. It means that Labour they can't draw a line under it and move on. They can't draw a line under it. It's something that's going to now run and run. Unless they do something, unless they announce something unexpected in the budget. But that sounds difficult because they've already implemented the policy. It's already in law. So it's like really hard to imagine anything being announced in the budget that sort of corrects it. They say it's not that big of an issue for Labour. 80% don't vote for them anyway. No, well, more of them did this time. But no, I take your point. However, there are people who do vote for Labour who have elderly parents or grandparents. And it's a little bit like a mini Partygate for me, this. In that, what was it that would... See, Boris Johnson after Partygate, he kept saying, it'll blow over, and his supporters kept thinking, yeah, people will have forgotten it in a few years. And that is usually the case with an unpopular policy. I was going to say a bad policy. Some good policies can be unpopular, but they turn out that they're good policies. And it is true that people have forgotten them in a few years' time. But if you, with a policy, if that policy can be blamed for someone's death, they don't forget that. I had a friend who died, and as far as I am concerned, it was a direct result of a policy that David Cameron brought in. I don't forget that. That's been like 10 years now. I don't forget that. And the same will apply here. If someone's elderly parent or grandparent or someone or friend dies because their home's too cold, doesn't matter whether it's actually related to the winter fuel payments or not. If they think it is, as far as they're concerned, they'll think the government's killed that person. And that is something that will stay with them for the next election. That is why it goes in the ugly category. It's for the sake of saving what? A few £100 million, maybe £1 billion. And I know every billion, we can't just dismiss the odd billion here and there. We know Rachel Reeves is having a torrid time getting the budget together in a way that means there is, because the Conservatives set it up to be an austerity budget. They set it up for austerity. And Labour, despite all the bell ends moaning about, oh, Labour just want more austerity. No, they are fighting furiously to avoid that, even though it's just a politically messy move. Wangi Peg then said, do I agree that we should also be pressuring Labour over plans and preparations for inevitable sea level rise, other repercussions of climate change, wind solar farms, GB, not enough? Yes, but what I would say is, like at the moment, I just think in this country you might do better to warn about like coastal erosion, flood, like, because you need to, if you're going to really, because when we talk about pressure in the government, you can raise issues with the government, and they will. By the way, if you raise those issues with Labour ministers, they'll totally agree. None of them will disagree with you. This is a totally different government now. Doesn't mean they'll do anything about it though. You have to make it seem more sort of prescient to the general population if you're going to really put pressure on the government. And I think things like flooding, pointing to flooding and erosion, coastal erosion, are probably like better ways to do it. Viv there say, many of us retired not on huge income, still happy to lose the winter fuel allowance, but there are some who genuinely will miss out on pension credits too. Yes, I mean, again, another thing in terms of the comms, Labour could be emphasising the fact, and they're not doing at all, that actually because they've been pushing to get more people to apply for pension credits are worth thousands a year, potentially. They're worth thousands. Never mind £200, £300, they're worth thousands. So there are some pensioners now, as a result of the fact that Labour have been promoting this and really pushing it, and like, apply, it's actually really easy. Some of the more vulnerable pensioners are actually getting loads more money. Now, that's not to say they're going to be like living the high life, because remember, if you're qualified for pension credits, you're not on much money. But nonetheless, I mean, they could present that. They could attack. I mean, I would attack, for example, I think it might be the Daily Express that's running this campaign to like halt the winter fuel allowance policy. And yet their same campaign doesn't say, but by the way, in the meantime, make sure you apply for pension credits. Where's that campaign? Where's the campaign? You know, their campaign is basically, it's the same thing with everyone else doing it. Their campaign is effectively helping millionaires get 200 extra quid. I know it's not all millionaires, but that's the consequence of their plan. I wouldn't mind if they were saying things like, here's how you need to apply for pension credit. It's really easy to do. You just have to ring up. But we actually think the whole policy should be scrapped. That would be fine. That would be totally justifiable. But when you just say we need to scrap this policy when it's quite clear they're not going to, and you don't say, but actually you might qualify for pension credit and get it and then get a load more as well. It's just, it's just people playing politics there. The other ugly one is the P&O Ferries reaction. I think this is throwing Louise Haig under the bus. First of all, I don't think she's done anything wrong, but more to the point, and I said this in my video today, I don't think she's done anything that Downing Street didn't know about in advance or shouldn't have seen coming. Like they must have known she was going to Dover, because she was in the House of Commons later that morning to present her bit on behalf of the government. So they knew she was going down to Dover. Why? What did they think she was going down to Dover for? She knew that they knew it was to link fire and rehire policy with P&O Ferries. So again, it's another very messy one. It's a very ugly one. But there we go. How about drainage, new repair, dams, reservoir, coastal erosion, seawalls, etc. Also, all things like this, like actually having floodplains again. We're an island that is prone, where there's too many inhabited places prone to flooding totally unnecessarily. You compare us to, say, the Netherlands. The Netherlands is geographically far more prone to flooding. And yet they dealt with the problem a couple of generations ago, didn't they? They just said, we don't like floods, we're going to do something to stop them. And they basically stopped them. So all of these things can be done. And that's what I would do. That's the sort of pressure I would put on the government. Because the immediate environmental problems we have are things like flooding. We get them every. Some people can't get insurance; they can't get house insurance because their street is flooded virtually every bloody year. So it's not possible to get insurance. Labour need to reevaluate their attitude to Israel. I think it needs tweaking, but bear in mind when you say their attitude towards it, it might take you a minute before you can post again, but be specific, Walt. What do you think they need to adjust it to? So that might come up in a little bit there. Maggie's saying floodplains and wetlands are needed. Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what you need to do. It's ridiculous that we would allow flooding of populated areas on a regular basis. It's economically damaging. It's damaging to people's health and morale. It makes it impossible. I mean, if you imagine the stress it causes people to not be able to get insurance when they know, people could get trapped in houses where they can't sell them because who's going to buy a bloody house that's effectively in a floodplain? Use Lancashire as a floodplain. No. We don't need to use the entire county. You say, surely selling weapons to Israel must be in the bad or ugly category. We don't sell weapons to Israel. We've never sold weapons to... Well, this government has never sold weapons to Israel. Doesn't do it. That's already a policy, and it's never not been a policy. Specifically, of course, anything that is or can be used to attack Gaza, or as it happens now, Iran or Lebanon. So that was straight away. That was pretty much done straight away. So, parts. Same with parts. Like literally anything. I mean, first of all, let's just be clear here as well. The UK government doesn't supply Israel with anything military at all. Unlike America, let us distinguish here. We do not supply Israel with any military equipment. However, we have an arms industry, and that does supply Israel with some things, but it does not supply them with anything that is or is at risk of being used in Gaza. And that has been the case for a long time. Although David Lammy only announced it relatively recently as a definite thing, they'd already put them on hold because Labour, remember, before they even came to power, did not exactly believe David Cameron, shall we say. So Labour were already saying, we're not sure that you should be selling these things. So as soon as they came to power, they were straight away on it. They couldn't... remember, they're not allowed to just ask for the legal advice that was given to David Cameron. You're not allowed to do that because that's for the eyes of the previous government. You're not allowed. So you have to do it yourself. You have to get it done again, which is what they did. But before that advice was brought forwards, they'd sort of temporarily suspended them anyway. So we actually haven't been selling them these things. It just doesn't... I don't know where you're getting this... It just hasn't happened. So the only things that anyone in this country is selling to Israel that has military capabilities are only those that can possibly be used defensively. That is it. So if you're... So you, again, it's one of these things. You really do need to... you need to understand what the actual thing is. So Walt has actually come back now. So stop saying Israeli military equipment. We're not doing... I cannot state it any more clearly. We are not doing. We haven't done. This Labour government has never done that. It stopped it immediately. Well, as quickly as it legally could. It stopped it. So we're not doing. Not a single piece of equipment produced in Britain has been sent to Israel while this Labour government have been in power that can possibly be used in Gaza. However, I thought we were supplying military equipment. No, the only military equipment we are supplying is that which definitely cannot be used in Gaza. It will include some stuff that can be used purely defensively, which, again, that is reasonable because, remember, although Israel are attacking civilian targets, so are the people, so are everyone else. We can't say that, we shouldn't allow weapons to be sold to attack one civilian population but allow it another. So yeah, in terms of Labour's policies on Israel, I mean, I was dismayed, for example, to hear someone representing the Jewish movement, the Jewish Labour movement, basically, trying to argue that what Israel was doing was not genocide but defence. And it's like, well, I mean, it's both, but because it is genocide, it's not justifiable defence. It is defence, but there are legal limits to what actions you can take to defend yourself. So yeah, so there are, you know, and I would also say, because I keep saying of people, if you're going to attack Israel, what it's doing in Gaza, which is fine, you must also at the same time say, but it's also not justifiable what Hamas and Hezbollah do to Israelis or wants to do. Because remember, the only difference in scale is, oh, well, the Israelis kill more Palestinians. Yes, they do, because they can. If Hamas and Hezbollah had the ability to kill as many Israelis as Israel has killed Palestinians, they would do in a heartbeat. So they're all as evil as each other. And for my money, although Labour are sort of saying that, they're attacking Hamas and Hezbollah a lot more strongly than the Israeli government. Now, to begin with, I could see the justification, because you know that Hamas and Hezbollah cannot be negotiated with. But the Israeli government, at least the wider government, Benjamin Netanyahu is a nutter, but at least the wider government, you could feel you could talk to them. But now I think we've got to a point where I just don't see it ending. I don't actually know how it ends. And I can't read anything written by anyone who seems to know what they're talking about, who sees a way for this to end. At the moment, all I see from the outside, say two-state solution will never work. It has to work. The only way the two-state solution, it has to work. In fact, there is nothing else. The only other thing is the literal destruction of an entire people. So you cannot ever say the two-state solution works. It must work. It must be made to work. But also, it is not going to work until enough powers in the region, and America as well, let us be honest, decide that it must work. And I will be completely honest, I have watched this unfold over the last year and a half. Sorry, not year and a half. Sorry, it's not quite a year. Year and a bit, I should say. And I have to say, I am amazed that we've been able to see it get this far and it hasn't caused like a reaction that says this needs to stop. That's what worries me. But anyway, do I know if Labour are doing anything for people with disabilities or not? I can't say what they're doing specifically, other than what's in the manifesto. Because, as we said before, they're not making a song and dance about it. So if they have more detailed plans, I'm afraid I don't know what they are, which is, as I said, a problem, because vulnerable people need the most explanation. If there's something you're going to do, but it's not just yet, you still need to communicate it with them. So the political leadership of all combatants don't want it to end. That is the problem. It is the problem. And it is where I understand where the diplomatic effort has to be on Israel, because we know why this is. Benjamin Netanyahu, I mean, don't get me wrong. He probably loves it, because people have described it as it's effectively fairly blatant ethnic cleansing. Yes, it is. But ultimately, this is Netanyahu's way of stopping going to prison. You know, but I don't get how the wider political structure in Israel doesn't see that this is actually incredibly dangerous. Like they say they're doing it to make Israel safer. This is not making Israel safer. This is making Israel more vulnerable. They are creating hatred of Israelis. They're making themselves look like monsters. Because people outside a country do not distinguish between the government's actions and that country's. because they assume that the government is acting according to the will of the population, don't they? You know, if a government anywhere in the world acts in a particular way, people think that's what the country's like because it's got that sort of government. Carson, they're saying the two-state solution will not work with right-wing Jews in Iran back to militias who want river to the sea. Well, no, that's why you have to take it out of their hands. That's why it needs, it needs the wider region and America. America can force Israel. Collectively, I don't just mean the president. We know that's not true. But collectively, America has the ability to force Israel to behave itself. And collectively, the Arab world has the capacity to force these groups, Hamas, Hezbollah, and others, to behave themselves as well. And it's like they all want it, and yet they don't all want it at the same time as strongly. Luke, they're saying, what do I think about Richard Murphy's modern monetary theory in which a country with its own fiat current can print as much money as it wants with tax only uses a tool to control inflation? So Richard Murphy has basically gone down a rabbit hole. What Richard Murphy is arguing that Labour should do is actually a more extreme version of what Liz Truss did. He's basically saying, it's like money doesn't exist, and technically it doesn't. It's just numbers on a balance sheet, but you have to pretend as if it does exist. At the end of the day, what is it that did Liz Truss in? As she will point out herself, she didn't implement any of her economic policies. Didn't get time. Her economic policies that she was announcing, they were due to come into effect the following year in April. She hadn't given any indication that these were going to be put in place early. In theory, they could have been. She didn't suggest that. She just said, this is what we're going to do next year. Nothing was implemented, and yet she was ushered out of power. Why? Because gilt investors went, no, that's crazy, and crashed the pound. And that was the end of her political career in a matter of days. And Richard Murphy wants Labour to do that on crack. He's I can understand. He's gone mad. He used to be worth reading, but he's. For anyone who knows Matt Goodwin, you may know that he was actually a respected political scientist at one time, until he fell down his far right rabbit hole. Richard Murphy's done the same, or he's doing it as a grift. I really don't know. I don't actually know. Is it a conscious grift, or has he actually just gone loopy? But you do not, in all seriousness, get to argue that Labour should do what Liz Truss did, because that's just mental. Our local train station got granted £22 million for remodelling. Bloody hell. Is that what it costs these? I suppose it does. Things do cost a lot. First effective investment for us since 2009, I believe. Have you actually, though? Because hasn't Rachel Reeves put hasn't she effectively, not permanently, but blocked all new investment plans until they've gone through them again? So has that not been affected by the block? Because I know there's a lot of transport projects that Reeves has put a hold on until they can be re-evaluated. Although I do think, by the way, that the purpose of the re-evaluation will be to shift investment from road to rail. So I imagine rail investment is more likely to get the go-ahead again in time. But I thought an awful lot of it had been delayed. But anyway. Liz can't trust has the same special PR consultant as Rishi. Well, I mean, they didn't have the same ones, but I mean, they both surrounded themselves with people who just thought exactly as they did, which is fatal. Absolutely fatal. One of the things that did my head in most about Sue Gray leaving the Downing Street operation was you've removed someone who doesn't think like they do. Like, my worry is you get too many people in who all come from the same sort of background or same sort of thinking, and you just get this groupthink, this echo chamber, and it's incredibly damaging to good government, to good management of anything. But there we go. So the previous plans comported with an austerity focus. The new economy is about abundance. In it. The new budget is very much supposed to be about investment. Labour have said that it is going to be a big investment budget. And we're starting to now start to get a few more details because I think they realise that, you know, the news is hungry for details. So they're also going to, or there's a suggestion anyway, we don't know until they've announced it. There's a suggestion they're going to include things like, you know, they're going to consider hospital and school buildings to be necessary for growth. Because one of the problems is, so the Treasury remember, it's not, Rachel Reeves doesn't work out the budget. It's Treasury officials who work out the budget. She just gives them their sort of the policy leanings, their sort of parameters. And one of the problems is the way the Treasury is set up. It comes up with plans that are going to give investment plans that give a return. But if they consider a particular type of investment doesn't give a return or doesn't give a return within a short enough period of time, they consider it just to be a cost and no benefit. So then they don't come up with it in the plans. So what Reeves is trying to do is to change that so that they think, well, you don't have to worry about a 5-year return, a 10-year return is fine. And also making sure that they understand that schools and hospitals do give a return, because it's not an easy one to judge. We know they give a return. We know that schools give a return in the long term because they're teaching people the skills we need to power our economy. We know that hospitals give a return because they get workers back to productivity quickly. Even though, yes, I know that the NHS mostly deals with elderly people and very young people rather than workers, but it also needed for workers to get back up to productivity. So there is going to be a change of philosophy within the Treasury, and and it may well be that is the sort of thing that continues over the next few years. You can't change the whole thing overnight, but there are some big changes coming, it seems to me. Anyway, last few minutes, let us have a look. You say that the ban on petrol cars not realistic in the timescale. It's a set timescale. We need it, but it needs to be achievable. Well, we will see. I agree. The fact that the Tories have dragged their feet on it makes it a lot more difficult than was the case when that deadline was first set. I completely agree with that. But we will see. Promoter there saying, if this is about investment, wouldn't it have been better to announce the budget before the summit to maximise investments from it? I would put it the other way around. It would have been better to have the investment summit after the budget. So the budget, I mean, at the end of the day, the quicker they'd have held the budget, the less they'd have been able to do with it. Because remember, it's not, although it's sort of done, it's not. There's news coming out all the time that Rachel Reeves, like every time there's some new economic data, that changes the OBR's forecast, which is why they're quite pleased that August showed some growth, because it was making a hell of a mess of the figures. So literally, the longer you delay the budget, because it takes a long time to do a budget, the longer you delay the budget, the more you can do with it. So I would have said it would have been better to have the investment summit after the budget rather than saying the budget before it, because that would imply the budget would have to have been done by now. But you are right, and it's not just you. Like, there's plenty of economists saying the same thing, and financial reporters. It doesn't make that much sense to have the investment summit before you've had the budget. Certainly. If a lot of preparations for sea level rise, etc., will need lots of concrete. I hear one of the only things carbon capture is used for is mass producing concrete. But remember, as I keep saying, the carbon capture investment from the government, which again is not what it's tiny. The investment is actually tiny. It's a job creation thing. It's a job transition thing. People keep going on as if Labour think that carbon capture is the answer to their net zero problems. And I know Labour have billed it as that themselves. Yes, sure. But that's not what it's for. It's to help transition jobs from oil and gas to green technology. Because what they don't want to do is wind down an industry in the way Thatcher did it, because then that is like ghost town city. But anyway, there we go. Phil for Chief Spad. No, they wouldn't like me. I wouldn't get on with them. I'd be out quicker than Sue Gray. Because I am from a part of... See, it's quite funny. Like when they, when I used to do a lot of online gaming with other people, and obviously a lot of people from Northern Europe, because people in Northern Europe all speak English. Like if you're Dutch or Finnish or Danish or Swedish, they all speak Norwegian. They all speak English really well. So you end up, people on online gaming, people in Britain tend to end up on the same English servers as all the Northern European countries, right? And no end of Dutch people would sort of say to me, the British, the English are so uptight, And I would have to keep out, because they'd say they'd been on business somewhere and they don't like the Dutch way of plain speaking. And I would say, you're talking about south of England, aren't you? Yeah. It's a different thing in the north of England, particularly in Yorkshire. So I would go in with my... I'm not diplomatic, should we put it that way? I'm not diplomatic. I understand the benefit of diplomacy, but not in a close-knit team. So my attitude is, in a close-knit team, like, Downing Street, you haven't got time to fanny about. So you've actually got to get straight to the point. That means blunt speaking. And do you know what? Like I said in my video today, if people get the ump just because you come out and say it how it is, or how you see it as it is anyway, if you're too sensitive to that, should you really be in the crucible of Downing Street? Are you really cut out for top level government if you're that sensitive and thin-skinned? I would say not. But they obviously are, because if they couldn't handle Sue Gray, they would hate me. Absolutely hate me. Plus it would mean having to go to London now and then. But there we go. We'll leave it there. Thanks very much for calling on, everyone. Nice little chat. Have a great rest of evening. And until next time, I'll see you later.